Many Americans, whether liberal or conservative, trace contemporary liberalism back to the late 19th and early 20th century reform movement known as progressivism. Progressivism was a movement that began in the cities and that came to dominate both political parties and national politics during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Indeed, at least 2 American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, openly identified themselves as progressives and their programs with the progressive cause. Yet a close examination shows that the progressives held many views totally repugnant to contemporary liberals. Now, as with other historical myths that we've looked at, there is a kernel of truth in the supposed connection between progressivism and contemporary liberalism. But it has been grossly overstated, and it distorts the history and meaning of progressivism. It also distorts the meaning of contemporary liberalism and contemporary conservatism, for that matter. Part of the problem is that our definitions of liberalism and conservatism have changed rather dramatically over the past century, and they have done so more than once. But the problem is also due to a misunderstanding regarding who the progressives were and just what they stood for. This lecture will attempt to address that misunderstanding by analyzing the progressives and their progressive movement. After doing so, it will then explore the ways in which progressivism is related to contemporary liberalism and the ways in which it is not. Now, the confusion over progressivism is quite understandable. It was never a unified movement. It contained many different groups with many different goals. That fact is clearly illustrated by both the legislation that was passed during the progressive era and the 4 constitutional amendments that were passed during this time period. These constitutional amendments, numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19, established the income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and the vote for women. Now, what in the world, one might ask, do those 4 have in common? Situation is similar in regard to progressive legislation. Major progressive bills included establishment of the first income tax, bills to regulate the railroads, antitrust legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, major attacks on civil liberties during and after World War I, and immigration restriction. Again, one might ask, what in the world do these have in common? The progressive era would also see the creation of numerous professional organizations with enforced professional standards for doctors, for lawyers, for others. It would also see the rise of social work, social workers, settlement houses to help the immigrants and the poor. We will also see the rise of a national birth control movement during this time, a further deterioration in the condition of African Americans, a major movement in the churches known as the social gospel movement promoting progressive reform, and a racist eugenics movement that sought to sterilize those it labeled inferior. Once again, what in the world do these have in common? The movement also elected 2 of our best-known presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But they came from different political parties, and they had strikingly different personalities. They ran against each other in 1912 on 2 progressive platforms, but diametrically opposed platforms, and they came to hate each other. The progressive movement also included people famous in other areas of American life, but with little, if anything, in common. You had philosophers such as William James and John Dewey, the father of our modern educational system. You had social workers such as Jane Addams, who was also a famous peace activist. At the same time, you had army officers such as General Leonard Wood, who helped bring progressive efficiency to the Army and who wanted to inculcate Army values into the civilian population. You had ministers such as Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden, who were leaders in the social gospel movement. You had jurists such as Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, highly influential Supreme Court justices who came from different generations. You had expose journalists called muckrakers by Theodore Roosevelt, such as Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell. And you had novelists such as Stephen Crane, Theodore Dreiser, Frank Norris, Jack London, Upton Sinclair. You had imperialists such as Theodore Roosevelt and anti-imperialists such as Robert La Follette. Roosevelt was also an avid internationalist, whereas La Follette is known as an isolationist. Nor is that the end of the contradictions and the confusion. Progressive programs included many ideas from the 1892 populist platform cited in a previous lecture, but most progressive leaders had been anti-populist in the 1890s. Most progressives wanted to regulate big business, but numerous business leaders were part of the movement. Many immigrants supported the movement, even though many of its leaders were anti-immigrant. Many African Americans supported the movement, even though many of the movement's leaders were highly racist. And many women supported the movement, even though many of its leaders were proponents of legislation to protect women because of their alleged inferiority. Now, historians have for many decades explored progressivism and tried to understand these contradictions and this movement. Perhaps it is best described, in the words of one historian, Robert Wiebe, as a search for order, an attempt to redefine American politics and American society in light of the revolutionary changes that had been created by the Industrial Revolution and the ensuing urbanization of the country. In this regard, a new class of urban white-collar professionals created by the Industrial Revolution and urbanization, accountants, clerks, mid-level managers, would join with the older urban professional middle class of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen to be two of the driving forces in the movement, though far from the only ones. Now, the essential progressive program focused on a series of general goals. One was to end the abuses of power and the corruption that had come to dominate American economic and political life. Progressives wanted to replace corrupted institutions with reformed ones that would restore power to the people via such measures as the initiative, so that the people could initiate legislation rather than the corrupt state legislatures, the referendum where people could vote directly on this legislation, and the recall whereby corrupt officials could be thrown out of office before the end of their term. Progressives also favored direct election of senators instead of via corrupt state legislatures, the secret ballot, and extension of the franchise to many previously denied it. Progressives also wanted to restore morality to American politics and American life. Honesty in business, honesty in government, honesty in production. Witness the Pure Food and Drug Act. Progressives wanted to help the victims of industrialization, children and women forced to work, the new immigrants, and others. Progressives wanted to use scientific and efficiency principles and expertise from both the academic world and the business world to minimize disorder and establish cooperation. In progressive minds, expertise and morality were fused. They were not contradictory, they were complementary, As Woodrow Wilson once said to the experts that joined him going to the Paris Peace Conference, a group known as the Inquiry, "Tell me what is right, and I will fight for it." The experts would know what was right, what was morally right, as well as what was factually right. Progressives also wanted to professionalize and regularize aspects of American life by establishing clear standards for doctors, lawyers, and other professionals. And finally, progressives wanted to restore a sense of discipline, virtue, and service, to get people to look beyond their narrow self-interest and look instead to the good of others and to the good of the country as a whole. The thought was best expressed by the philosopher William James in his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. War, he believed, was hideous, but it did get people to think not first of themselves, but of the soldier next to them, beyond their own self-interest. If we could get the civilian population to think the way soldiers do, James said, it would be a great advance. General Leonard Wood felt similarly. He called for inculcating military virtues into civilian life. Now, for progressives, the key tool to do all of this was positive government action. This is the key shift in what we might call the liberal perspective, and the one very clear link, in fact, some would say the only clear link, between the progressives and contemporary liberals. A belief that government is not the problem, but the solution to the problems that plagued American life at this time. Now, traditional 18th and 19th century liberalism feared government power. It saw government power as the key source of tyranny throughout history, and it had sought to limit government power in whatever ways it could. Witness in this regard the policies that we have previously discussed of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. But progressives turned this traditional liberalism on its head by arguing that the large monopolistic corporations and the corrupt urban political machines had become the key problems, and that positive government action was now imperative to control big business, to reform the political and economic systems, and thereby to restore and save the American dream. Now, there is no central theorist for the movement, but one of the most important progressive thinkers was an individual named Herbert Croly, who wrote a book entitled The Promise of American Life. What Croly essentially did was to attack Adam Smith's hidden hand that laissez-faire would result in everything being rosy. The marketplace, he argued, was no longer self-regulating, and it was not leading automatically to better things in the economic sphere or in any other sphere. The belief that it was, Croly maintained, was actually helping to destroy the American dream. And what was needed to restore the promise of American life was greater government power, nationalization, centralization. Or as one cliche to summarize the progressive movement put it, use Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. Now, while progressives tended to agree on these general goals and the positive use of government, they disagreed over just how government should be used. For example, should it be used in terms of regulating big business to break down large monopolistic corporations, to smash big business, or should it instead merely seek to regulate them? This fact can be most clearly seen in the competing progressive platforms of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the presidential election of 1912. Wilson's New Freedom sought to use the government to break up big business in order to restore competition. Roosevelt's New Nationalism argued that this was both impossible and counterproductive. Instead, government should seek to control and legitimize big business. Government should also play the key role as arbitrator in differences between business and labor. Now, far from accidentally, this indirect attack on laissez-faire also led the New Nationalists to propose legislation to help the victims of industrialization, since these people, in effect, recognized that laissez-faire was not working and that some people would need government help. Now, those who opposed the progressive call for positive government action would henceforth be considered conservatives. But in actuality, they were retaining one of the major principles of 18th and 19th century liberalism: fear of government power. In that belief, these American conservatives were diametrically opposed to traditional European conservatives, who favored strong government power. Indeed, some favored absolute government power. It is important to realize in this regard that American conservatives and liberals both base their belief systems on John Locke's concept of the social contract, as was discussed in an earlier lecture. So do those who consider themselves neither conservatives nor liberals, but moderates. None of them follow the concepts of Thomas Hobbes and other European conservative thinkers that underlay the very different European definition of conservatism. Hobbes had maintained that the natural, original state of human life was, in his words, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and that the only way to organize a society so as to overcome this was to give total power and obedience to a monarch or to a small aristocratic group empowered to decide every issue. Now, while some American conservatives just might agree with Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature, they do not agree with his proposed solution of absolute obedience to a powerful, centralized, authoritarian government. Instead, they argue, as did 18th and 19th century liberals, that strong centralized government, not big business, remains the greatest threat to freedom. This fear of big government has led to the crack that an American conservative is actually a worshiper of dead liberals. If that is true, does that make a liberal a worshiper of dead conservatives? It is also important to note that while the logic of progressive thought does lead to many programs contemporary liberals could support, it also led to many programs that are anathema to contemporary liberalism. Let me name but a few of these. A desire to help the victims of industrialization, which contemporary liberals would applaud, combined with the desire to restore morality to American life, translated during this time period into an imposition of middle-class American morality via legal, social coercion in numerous areas. Some have argued that that is something that contemporary conservatives might support as well. Another link of conservatives to the progressive movement. The Prohibition Amendment, as well as laws against certain drugs that were passed during this time period, were partially justified on the grounds that alcohol and drugs are immoral and that they create dependency that holds back the working class. In this mode of thinking, social reform becomes social control as the government assumed functions previously performed by the church, by the family, and by the local community. The desire to help the victims of industrialization would also lead to a major movement to Americanize the new immigrants at the expense of their traditional cultures. Now, destroying traditional cultures may seem to us as anything but helpful to new immigrants, but that is because our values in this regard have changed so dramatically over the last century. Today, our belief in this regard is aptly summarized by Star Trek's prime directive: not to upset or alter the cultures of other life forms with whom the Enterprise comes into contact. But the belief then was that the best thing you could do for the new immigrants was to make them think and behave just like middle-class white Americans. Furthermore, The progressive emphasis on science, on expertise, and on professional standards actually hurt the new immigrants and other poor by depriving them of the doctors, lawyers who had been willing to serve them. While those individuals might not have been very well trained, at least they were willing to provide service to the poor. Similarly, progressive efforts to destroy political corruption deprived the new immigrants and other poor of the urban political machines that took care of them, in return, of course, for their vote and acceptance of the graft that went with these machines. Tammany Hall's George Washington Plunkett had admitted years earlier to a reporter that he knew every man, woman, and child in his district. And when there was a fire or some other emergency, he didn't ask questions as reformers would, get them to fill out forms. Instead, he found them a place to live, got them clothing to replace what they had lost, and they gratefully repaid him with their vote. The fusion of science with pre-existing racism would reinforce the desire to help the new immigrants by Americanizing them and destroying their native cultures. It would also lead to immigration restriction to prevent any more of these inferior peoples from coming over and competing with American labor. That fusion of science with pre-existing racism would also lead to the rise of a movement known as eugenics, and with it calls for forced sterilization of inferiors so as to improve the genetic base of the population. Indeed, this progressive era might very well have been the height of scientific racist thought in this country. It would witness in this regard the publication of Madison Grant's notorious Passing of the Great Race, soon followed by Henry Ford's previously cited anti-Semitic tracts. Nor is it accidental in this regard that the great progressive Woodrow Wilson would expand segregation in the federal government, introducing it to several departments where it had not existed before, and that he would praise D.W. Griffith's racist film, Birth of a Nation, as, quote, history written with lightning. Now, this racism, along with the emphasis on the imposition of American middle-class standards of expertise and morality, would also lead many progressives to become avid imperialists in the name of what Rudyard Kipling had popularized as the white man's burden, the need to help these inferior peoples by ruling them. It is no accident in this regard that the progressive era coincides with the establishment, as discussed in the last lecture, of the informal as well as the formal American empire. In fact, most of the military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean occurred during the progressive era, under both the Republican Theodore Roosevelt and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. And the progressive emphasis on nationalism and centralization would reinforce, if not create, the suppression of civil liberties during World War I in the name of patriotism. It was done via creation of the first American Propaganda Bureau, the Committee on Public Information, and the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918. Those laws virtually outlawed dissent against the war and criticism of the United States government, and they would be supported by the Supreme Court. Indeed, Eugene Debs would be jailed again under these laws, this time for opposing the war. In addition to all of these problems, much progressive legislation simply failed. Big business today is in many ways more centralized and destructive of competition than it was 100 years ago. Big government has in many ways failed as well, failed to do what it promised, and to many today, whether rightly or wrongly, big government appears worse than the problems it originally grew to address. Fascinating is the fact that progressive political reforms would coincide with a decline in the percentage of Americans who vote, not an increase as the progressives had desired and expected. Nevertheless, progressivism created much of the broad value structure that we live with today, whether liberal, conservative, or in between, regarding such issues as efficiency, expertise, morality, government control, as well as the inculcation of such values through our educational system. We still use the word progressive. In this regard, we are in a situation similar to the continued use of the word populism. Do contemporary people who use the label progressive have anything in common with the original progressive movement? The answer is probably similar. This is not a lecture on contemporary progressivism, but as with populism, there are links, but there are dramatic differences. What I think can be clearly stated is that most, if not all of us, liberals, conservatives, moderates, progressives, remain linked to progressive ideas. And progressivism thus remains very relevant to contemporary American life. But it does not necessarily remain relevant in the ways that we think it does.